In various books about Genghis, it is mentioned that he destroyed the city of Balkh and massacred its people, even though Balkh had been destroyed by an earthquake 100 years before Genghis, and its inhabitants had moved to Mazar-i-Sharif. They mention the destruction of several other cities, which some still don't know the location of because they are lies. Central Asia, with an area of 1 million square kilometers, had 100 cities, not just a few. Geographical locations and names are completely wrong. When reading Mongol books, also look at the map to see how wrong these lying fools were. Mahmud Khwarezmi told the king that Genghis's army was a drop, and the Khwarezmian army was the sea, and why didn't anyone in Khwarezm's court, which had seen war, say anything? They mention numbers of 100,000 and 200,000 for city defenders and a few 100,000 for attackers, as if counting sheep. These numbers may appeal to the insane and simple-minded, but they are not real. They speak of the Mongol army's vastness and darkness, which was supposedly made up of many Iranian forces leading the Mongol army, as if they were a flock of goats or sheep, not enemies of each other. Enemies of history lie, and simple Iranians believe them. The enemies of Iran's history hit two birds with one stone, implying Iranians are cowardly and simple for believing these lies. But the era of fabricating lies is over, and we will speak the truth. In ancient wars, both cavalry and infantry were used depending on the battlefield and war strategy. For instance, to conquer a city or fortress, infantry had to be used. The cavalry, due to horseback riding from adolescence, had bowed legs, a physical weakness for movement in infantry combat. Historians and storytellers before the 20th century knew this problem and considered it in their writings when crafting the Mongol tale. But in the 20th century, with the advent of cars and tanks and the absence of cavalry, this important issue was forgotten, and fictional historians overlooked this physical problem in history. In some places, they say the defenders and Iranians were deceived, and this deception continued for several days until their destruction. Who is foolish enough to believe such naive words? Elsewhere, they write that Sultan Muhammad fled 700 kilometers to the west in a short period during the chaos, and after going through Mazandaran and Jilin, which is very difficult, he returned 700 kilometers to the east. They told the same lies as in the invasion of Alexander. They wrote ridiculous Iranian military strategies that did not align with the military thoughts of the time. At that time, there were great wars between the kings and khans of Iran, but none of them used these absurd methods. Consider the wars of that time in their own context. Who wrote these forged letters, and what were they? Why isn't there a single Mongol or Chinese sword, armor, or any combat tool in Iranian museums? Why is there no trace of a battle on the battlefields or deserts, or any trace of a Mongolian presence in Iran? Why is there not a single Mongolian or Eastern Turkic word in the tomb and dome of Sultan Muhammad Khadavan, who they say was Mongol? Why did Ismaili scholars, like everyone else, join the Mongols, and why did they say the rest of the Ismailis were killed? They say that Genghis, a criminal drunkard, was so just that no one in the entire camp could pick up a fallen whip except its owner. They wrote so many contradictory statements that it's true what they say liars forget. Elsewhere, they wrote that Genghis was deeply superstitious, and such a person could not have been great under those conditions. Why, from all the treasures and jewels supposedly looted from China, is there not even a single ring or sash in Iranian museums? Most importantly, gathering an army of hundreds of thousands and moving them across 5,000 kilometers toward Iran is completely impossible. How simple-minded must their audience have been to accept such stories? Of course, they provided simplistic explanations for these lies. For example, they wrote that the Yasa was important. If it was so important, why isn't it in hand? Social and historical structures are the key to understanding history. If a historian doesn't understand social history, they cannot discern historical issues and are deceived by fraudulent books called history. To love a country and strive for its prosperity and elevation, one must first know it. If you read the remnants of the Asa, you'll see it's so full of nonsense and superstitions that it surpasses all its kind. They speak of Mongol tribal meetings as if several illiterate people from small, superstitious villages were scholars. Westernized historians think that in the 21st century, people are still simple enough to take these nonsenses seriously. If a few 100,000 people went to Iran from the small, sparsely populated, poor land of Mongolia, where they say tribes were still fighting each other drunkenly, then who was guarding this enemy-ridden land? They even wrote that many Mongol princes and commanders died from excessive alcohol consumption. In every page of Genghis's stories, there are so many nonsensical, contradictory statements that I don't know which one to highlight. The past royal regime, due to its subservience to the enemies of history and geography, could not use knowledgeable individuals in government and educational institutions. Therefore, they repeated the lies of history to satisfy them and kept the high character of Iranians down, not allowing historical and cultural learning to reach the people. Who was foolish enough to believe these fabricated writings as history? They say Termiz was the first city the Mongols captured and leveled, and how an old woman, hoping not to be killed, shouted that she had swallowed a pearl. But the ruthless Mongols cut open her stomach and retrieved the pearl. Then Genghis ordered them to cut open the stomachs of all the corpses for pearls. Find the lie in this story yourself, as there is no mention of such an event in the histories and records of that time in Termiz. They lie that out of millions of captives, they separated craftsmen and military masters and killed the rest to fill the trenches. These simpletons thought we were as foolish as they are to accept such nonsense as history. They wanted to portray the Iranian people as a paralyzed nation. To justify their lies, they say Genghis's success was due to his care in maintaining communication across his vast empire and managing a central intelligence system. Anyone who claims to be a historian but cannot analyze this false statement in the context of the events and capabilities of the Mongols should quit studying history altogether. How many lies have they told about Mongol horsemanship? But since liars forget, elsewhere, they wrote that the Mongols were such heavy drinkers they would fall off their horses. As if their Iranian and Muslim opponents, born with sports and warfare in their blood, who weren't drunkards, hadn't seen horses. They say the Mongols had good geographic maps and road maps. The question is, then why isn't one of these maps available today? There is no historical fort or barracks in Mongolia to suggest that in Genghis's supposed time, soldiers and commanders were trained there, nor is there any tool for coordinating and supporting this fictional giant army. Fake historians should be ashamed of believing the lies about Alexander and Genghis and wake up. Colonial-minded Western liars write that Genghis cared about commerce and that the Mongol treasuries were full, and simpletons believe it. Does commerce flourish in just a few years? Commerce is rooted in the history of nations. They don't say why there are no caravanserais in Mongolia or why there is no trading item from that time in Mongolian museums. They say some warriors thought the Mongols were fighting the Crusaders, so they joined the Mongol army. This is where 100 exclamation marks should be placed because they lied that the Mongols were first defeated by a 20,000-strong Baghdad army. So, where is that supposedly invincible army of hundreds of thousands? They claim the Mongols massacred Sunni cities in Iraq while Shia cities and Shia figures took control of matters. Where is the important fortress remnant in Lake Urmia? Why were the treasures placed in such an easily accessible location? Because the one who wrote this lie mistook the lake. The enemies defeated Iranians on paper and looted massive amounts of wealth from Iran, but where is even a fragment of it in any museum? Pay attention to these absurd statistics. Nishapur had a population of 1.8 million, Herat 1.6 million, and so on for other cities. What kind of fool would believe such numbers? Do you know why? They say the bigger the lie, the easier it is for simple people to believe. 30 years ago, all my Genghis and Mongol books were so heavily annotated and critiqued that there's no white space left. In short, the enemies of Iran took advantage of opportunities and fed the world whatever lies they wanted. With the new awareness of this century, along with new technologies, we must rid ourselves of these lies. Really, the Iranian historians who parrot these lies and nonsense should be ashamed. The Muslim historians and Anas Simhir who wrote the history of the Mongols never mention the Grey Wolf. Abu al-Qazi Khan and Rashid al-Din, who claim to have seen many Genghis letters and written about the origin of the Mongols, only mention Borchino, meaning Grey Wolf in Mongolian, as a notable figure. According to the writings of these same historians, Alan Koev was impregnated by a man who descended from the sky, and Genghis Khan was born of it. The wolf among the Mongols is also a symbol of wrath and fury. History records that when Genghis Khan heard the news of the killing of his envoys by the Khwarezm Shah, he became furious, climbed a mountain, and howled like a wolf. Thus, everyone understood that they must prepare for battle, and a harsh revenge would be taken against Khwarezm and the Khwarezm Shah. The army of hundreds of thousands, invincible even, was put on alert, accompanied by howling. Simple Iranians should not be surprised by the enemies of Iran's history, they should believe it. The most interesting part of the lie about the Mongol invasion states that they conquered all of Iran and China, yet in the small Jerusalem, they were forever finished off. Why in Jerusalem? Doesn't that seem ridiculous to you? There isn't even a single valuable historical book from Iran or China about the Mongol invasion from that time. Everything available is mere fabrications presented as historical books, which upon reading reveal their absurdity, having been written after the aforementioned dates. How is it possible for a massive army to be organized, march 5 to 10,000 kilometers forward, and there be not even one book about it, except for the foolish justifications written by colonizers and their agents? All Western liars confess that there is no evidence of the existence or the reality of Genghis Khan. Even the best general histories of the medieval world have not written anything about the events of the Mongol invasion. The story most utilized in the model for all the liars of the Mongol invasion is the work of Marco Polo, that is, the book of the description of the world. Marco Polo was a Venetian storyteller who never traveled beyond Constantinople, or present-day Istanbul, and did not venture into the East. Everyone in the West knows that Marco Polo was a great liar. When Marco Polo was in prison in Venice, he studied the fictitious tales of the conquests of Iran and India by Alexander the Great and drew inspiration from these myths. With the help of another like him named Rustig Hello, he even exaggerated the Mongols to be more significant than Alexander the Great. The malcontents and enemies utilized these fabrications instead of history. In the 13th century, besides Western and Central Europe, the entire world was under the control of Muslims, and Europe was in a poor economic and social condition. Due to the successes of Muslims, they harbored a great resentment towards the Eastern peoples. Since they could not defeat Muslims in the East and North Africa, they did so in stories and through the fictitious Mongols. For instance, Kublai, who does not appear in any of the Iranian, Chinese, or European books, has been named the Great Emperor Kublai Khan, and many Mongol leaders have been fabricated in this manner. Thus, their resentment burst forth from the pens of a few lying writers. In the 13th and 14th centuries, when Muslims virtually held all of the world, European religious missionaries, especially the French, wrote long narratives about the life of Genghis Khan without any evidence or documentation, and imposed it as history. During the time of Louis XIV, one of the court writers named Petit de la Croix, for political expediency, wrote about the Mongols in the way he wanted. In the Vatican archives, there is not a single letter from the 12th, 13th, or 14th centuries in the Mongolian language or script, but there are countless in Persian. Over the past 200 years, a small number of researchers have explored small sections of this area, the reason being the lack of living and authentic documents. Most researchers cannot regard the fabrications as history unless they are unaware. However, some, like Harold Lamb, create false or legendary characters or history, such as the stories of Hannibal, Charlemagne, Justinian, and Tamerlane. Ridiculously, the oldest history of the Mongols was written during the colonial period by American Mora J. A. Dusan, who comes from a family of reactionary capitalist politicians, and he gained important positions for this service. His 4-volume book on the history of the Mongols, from Genghis to Tamerlane, is now recognized in the West and among simple people as the best book. Other notable figures who have written about the Mongols include Austrian Orientalist Baron Joseph von Hammer, who discussed the Ilkhanids of Iran between 1841 and 1843, German Franktermann Erdmann, who wrote about the untroubled Genghis, and Englishman Henry Heraut, who wrote a hefty 4-volume book titled The History of the Mongols. In the 19th century, the Russians, who occupied a large part of the ancient continent, from Transoxiana and Greater Karaizin, tried to use the story of the Mongol invasion and massacre to weaken the Muslims. Therefore, Berthold wrote in 1900 about the rise and fall of desert emperors. Vladimir Tsaifov addressed the sensitive and difficult issues of the social and economic backgrounds of Mongol expansion, which had not been justified until that time. The books on the life of Genghis and the social regime of the Mongols greatly assisted the Western fabricators in understanding how a few illiterate and irreligious individuals could dominate advanced Muslims. Erich Heinisch, a German, published in 1948 The Secret History of the Mongols, which is a simple and insignificant legendary Mongolian book without a specified history. German Berthold Spieler wrote The History of the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanids, and French René Grousset wrote about the story of the Steppe Empire. A few other authors have written books on the Mongol period, which have utilized the aforementioned works. Many of the Mongolian fabricators claim that their sources are handwritten and unique, but it is surprising that others have not seen these handwritten sources. The two main sources used by these individuals are The History of the World Conqueror by Adam Malik Juvayni and Jamie Altawarek by Rashid Eldin Fazlullah. The core of the matter in these two books is a complete betrayal of Greater Iran, along with lies, exaggerations, and contradictions, which I have explained in the false narratives referred to as history books. Among thousands of books on the history of Iran, only Raudat al-Safa, Tariq-i Wazif, and Habib al-Siyar have very little and incomplete information about the Mongols, taken from these two aforementioned books.